The webinar today is focusing specifically on how our troubled media in Africa, and especially in South Africa, can be saved, can be sustained. I think all of us are aware that media organizations, as well as journalism across the world, they are facing an existential, economic, and financial crisis brought on by a variety of factors, including, obviously, as we all know now, COVID-19. But before that, even the advent of digital and social media and the economic recessions which have been witnessed in recent years, starting with the 2008-2009 recession, and now the recession which is currently accompanying COVID. And a range of other variables have affected our media institutions, indeed our journalism, and so on. We are very lucky today to have three distinguished speakers who I will introduce shortly. I start with Professor Harry Dagmo, a veteran of Rhodes University who has taught here for so many years, who is now lucky to be enjoying the sunshine, actually, at the Australian University of the Sunshine Coast. Welcome, Harry.
Thank you, Francis. Thank you. And it's wonderful
and
to be
Harry,
here.
Thank you. Harry has done research focusing on how media companies, indeed journalism, can be saved, looking particularly at what other countries are doing across the world in saving their journalism. So he will present to us a synopsis of that research, which I hope we can interrogate in terms of its applicability here in South Africa. Some from across South Africa may also want to look at it in that context. After Harry's presentation, we'll have Bulelwa Ngwana, who from the Open Society Foundation of South Africa, who will make a response. I must make a note here that her organization kindly funded this research. Thank you so much, Bulelwa. Last but not least, we have Sbu Gwala, who is the chairperson of the South African Editors Forum, which, as most of you in South Africa know, is the main body that represents the interests of journalists. Before we start, let me advise participants, please, if you have a question, if you can put it up or post it on the chat function on the right side of your Zoom platform. And also, please do keep both your video and audio links muted throughout the proceedings. We hope that you'll enjoy the presentations. Thank you. Over to you, Harry.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Francis, and hello, everybody. And it's wonderful to be with you, as I said earlier. I'm going to just share my screen with you briefly, and I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail. We really did want to encourage, and we do want to encourage as much discussion as possible. So I'm going to just share with you some of the highlights of the report. We are going to put the link to download the report into the chat now. We would have done so a little bit earlier, but there's always things that one needs to do in terms of page proofing and checking references and a few other things like that. But Michael is going to put that into the report, and you're welcome to either now or later. There's a lot of detail in there, and I'll just really take you through the highlights of that. So as Francis was saying, the existential crisis that has been this long durée of the news media has been going on for maybe 20 or 30 years now. The very considerable shifts in the business models, the shifts that have been increasingly to audience revenues, to thinking about moving away all over the world from advertising models. And that has been accelerated dramatically since the 2008 financial crisis. And in that kind of context, it becomes really important to ask, as so many people have done in so many contexts, in so many countries, what is going to become of public interest journalism, and what particularly is going to happen with local journalism. So this report is in that context. We covered it as another funded project, generously funded by the Open Society Foundation for South Africa in 2018 in the Paying the Piper report. And there are a great many other reports that have tried to deal with this and amalgamate thinking from around the world. And I'm going to mention a few of those, and there's some new and very exciting and succinct summaries of this. And I'm hoping this report will be one of those in terms of being succinct. I'm really going to touch on 4 things today and just focus on these. It's this core idea that somehow still takes a lot of getting used to. I think in many emerging democracies, in many decolonizing societies, in many areas where we have elites that sort of control the political system, where there's still a fairly high degree of patrimonialism in many developing countries. But even in the global north, you have systems which, as we've seen, for example, in the USA, but we've also seen them we also see them very clearly in Brazil, in the Philippines, in Turkey, in Hungary, where right-wing authoritarian, right-wing populist governments have become incredibly good at manipulating social media, at distorting the public sphere. And we've just seen now all sorts of new evidence as to how the last set of elections, not just in the USA, but more widely, state actors and just people with different agendas are able to work the system. And that comes on top of the very discombobulating effects. I don't want to use that word, but it's disconcerting. It has thrown people to as the more we learn about the precise ways in which our advertising income is being externalized, I think the more alarmed everyone gets, and that really sunk in with COVID. So this project started in 2019. It pivoted. It was going to be an update of Paying the Piper, and now it's really looking at these 4 areas, which we'll touch on today. So there are a series of findings in the report, and they cover these areas of particularly direct state support and what we call social funding, particularly what our stance is going to be, our strategic stance, our tactics, our strategies in terms of platform power, in terms of the very large multinationals that from a variety of countries, but particularly from the USA, that are bestriding the earth like colossal forces in our media ecosystems. And then just some more local considerations of our own public service media and the SABC and the fierce debates that are taking place there, and then looking a little bit at philanthropy. So that's all ordered a little bit more coherently in the report. So firstly, this idea of direct social subsidies. I'm again not going to go into it in a great deal, but one is trying to have in all societies a really good balance between state-provided media, particularly the public service media, the BBCs, the ABCs, the SABCs, the Namibian Broadcasting Corporation. So you're wanting that to provide a solid backbone of your news ecosystem. And that language of ecosystems and that language of the interdependency of the entire news infrastructure of journalism making and distribution, that kind of ecological approach is certainly one that I found very useful for a while now. And particularly as we turn after COVID into thinking about what the weakest links are, where the most damage has been done, we see that that it is precisely like you have apex predators, you have very small but critical publications at regional and rural levels. You have hyperlocal journalism that can feed in, if properly marshaled, if properly thought through, that can feed in and be part of, essentially a set of flows and a set of capacities that nations can build. So it's a useful thing to think about. So just to talk briefly and put aside just in a moment, a very under reported report, something that should have got a lot more attention that I'd really direct you to looking at again, is Julia Plessin's report that she did for the Association of Independent Newspapers. And that put on the agenda pretty firmly just how widely practiced direct state support is for media and for news media outside of the public service media. So this idea that it's an unusual thing, or that people pretty much only support their version of the SABC, is not the case. Yes, many of these countries are in the global north. Many of them are at different levels of development, and many of them are wealthier. But that is the way that the world is going and has been going for 30 or 40 years. Journalism is expensive to produce, and we need to take less of a laissez-faire, the market will provide approach. It is interesting for people that have looked at it comparatively in terms of global media systems, just how much we adhere in many ways to a more UK and American sense of the commercial media and the interaction of that. And I think we slowly have moved, and we need to maybe move even more firmly into centering ourselves around the public provision of news, which means a massive overhaul is necessary for the SABC to function in the ways that I think so many people thought it was starting to function 1994 onwards, where it gets more involved, not less involved, in provincial news, in regional news. It gets its very powerful radio stations developing their digital capacity so that people can get the news that they need in the language that they're most comfortable in at that particular point. So this is a widespread practice, and the philosophical shifts where they are taking place, even in countries that are very much into the laissez-faire private sector, COVID has changed all of that. So it is, just briefly on indirect, I don't think we need to talk about indirect terribly much. There is a small section on it in the report. We can talk about it more in the discussion, but certainly zero rating from a tax point of view, taking off VAT. These have been big deals in many countries. And just last year, both the EU and the UK have zero rated digital subscriptions for the first time. And that was taking an awfully long time. And then COVID hit, and suddenly they did it. But here, in terms of my experience of Australia over the last year, there doesn't seem to be that much price sensitivity in terms of trying to increase uptake of journalism. It's a great deal of other factors that go into it. And we may well find that in our markets as well, that even if there are more energy and more effort, and we go through a wide range of indirect possibilities in the findings one section in the report, they may not be enough to sufficiently increase demand for news organizations to get the revenues they need from audiences. And the other gigantic shift is precisely that shift towards audiences, but I'll come to that in a moment. So just to solidify that point, the top 5 countries in terms of Reporters Without Borders, in terms of press freedom, are countries that very heavily and have for a very long time subsidized their media and their news media way beyond just the public service media, with very substantial and very generous funding. So there are three kind of main topologies. A lot of people have done work on how do you kind of put these into buckets of things, but funding journalism salaries directly in various kind of ways. And we looked briefly just now at the BBC. Particularly the biggest thing I think that happened in the world, and I can see there's some people in the audience that have real expertise in this, has been these transitional innovation grants. And we'll talk about those in a moment, but very much giving support, sometimes once-off support, competitive grants for moving properly into digital. It's not something that legacy newspapers or even people that are coming to establish supposedly digitally native products do particularly well, because there's a lot more to it than just having a website or being a bit socially media savvy. And then using your public service media to support local journalism. So funding journalism directly, a lot of that has taken place over the last 5 years. There are very substantial and scary amounts involved. Canada is one of the most famous examples. We cover that in the report, 50 million Canadian dollars, 5-year effort. It really has been well reviewed. More than 140 newspapers were able to hire 168 journalists, well paid at but chosen by the newspapers, not through the usual human resource processes and the usual recruiting kind of processes, reporting to those editors. And it certainly does seem to be one way of dealing with that arm's length problem that we'll also talk about a little bit later. So as so many people have pointed out, in all of these funds, the BBC one as well, the Swedish one, the Danish ones that have been going for a long time, the new cadet funds that Australia started last year where they're funding cadets, it really is, how do you decide which outlets to support? So everybody's had to go through a convoluted and detailed and philosophically contested process to kind of figure out what set of criteria you're going to develop and who is going to be the body that's going to ensure that that is fair and balanced and as free as possible. Well, absolutely, in a maximal sense, it should be entirely free of political favoritism and political and political pressure of any kind. So you have to figure out that system about whether you're going to have a panel of experts and how they're going to be independent. Australia's cadet scheme, which began in 2018, they use a kind of expert model with quite a lot of NGOs involved to make the choices. Again, it's been pretty extensive, and they've focused them a lot on the rural areas and getting journalists, young cadet journalists, but well-funded, well-trained, out of journalism schools, going to work for 2 or 3 years. And they managed to do that in a way fairly uncontroversially in terms of the decisions that have been made. There have been some controversies, but certainly there is, it's been judged to be a kind of success. So in addition to those funding of journalists, the idea of regional funds, innovation funds, is probably the most significant set of innovation, is this idea that it's perfectly legitimate to say we are moving into at the age of information. We've been in this 20-year journey, and we need to help the biggest and the smallest organizations do this properly. And setting up high quality, again, fairly adjudicated, competitive grants to help people, particularly against small, regional, local, and a lot of our report does focus on local journalism. So the whole idea of the innovation fund, like the Australian Innovation Fund, is it says very specifically that they want you to be able to make your way in the world, but what's it going to take? And the report goes into just the kinds of projects that are funded and the criteria. A lot of the times it is about content management systems, it is about customer relationship management systems, but it's also about really getting a fantastic website. And I use the example of Grocot's Mail and Rhodes University, and Rhodes is very strong and special support over the last 20 years for Grocot's Mail. But taking Grocot's digitally properly has cost a great deal of money. Having people design a proper system that works, that does the content management in the background, etc., is a time-consuming and cash-intensive process. And Growcarts wouldn't have been able to do it and wouldn't have the good digital infrastructure, email, newsletters, social media capacity that it has without that. Even then, to weather the storm of COVID has been incredibly difficult for it. So just to move along, the BBC Local News Partnership, very much like the Canadian partnership, what I find fascinating about it and what so many other people have written about and picked up on is just how using the public service media, using the BBC, making it use its funds or giving it funds, the funds to do so, again, is a very interesting way of doing things. And if we can get the SABC right, it's something that I think we should consider quite powerfully in South Africa, because then it can be, it can help with that arm's length problem and have a fair and balanced mechanism for dispersing the funds. I'm not going to say too much more about it. There's a fair bit about it in the report, but it is very ambitious. It so far has been administered mostly by the BBC, but now they are shifting it to a much more standalone, not-for-profit body hitting the road this year. And also, and this is interesting about the notion of social funding, moving beyond just the BBC's money. So they're going to be taking philanthropic money, they're going to be taking corporate funding. So just mindful of the time, I'm just going to put a shout out to this wonderful report that's come out, Anya Schifrin's Saving Journalism. It's very concise, but very, very insightful. It came out after we'd done the bulk of our work, but if you can download it, it's available for free download. It covers a lot of these schemes particularly well. So do get that report as well and read it in conjunction, hopefully with our report, which is more sort of South African focused. Just very, very briefly on market power and the imbalance, because I know we're all going to want to talk about that a lot. So being in Australia and watching this conflict and this contestation between this government and Google and Facebook in particular, and the multinationals in general, has been really interesting, having kind of front row seats, been into journalism school and being involved in these debates and watching the media all the time. It's been headline news. It's Facebook stopped the sharing of news for a whole week just 3 weeks ago. No news organizations could share their news. People couldn't share an article they'd enjoyed in their local newspaper. It just was the most amazing thing to see Facebook going for that nuclear option. But essentially what has happened here, and we cover it in the report a fair amount, is that you've had an enormous amount of pressure put on the Australian government by the Murdoch press, by News Corp in particular, which is so powerful, with Fox News in America and the UK, and really its home base, in a sense, its original home base in Australia. And that pressure has made the government so determined because they are so beholden, the particular government that's in at the moment. And so there's been a misidentification essentially of what the problem is. And there's been a lot of commentary about this, and we comment on it in our report. It's not about, let's just be quite direct, it's not about Google and Facebook stealing the news. It's not really about the copyright approach that Europe took and that Spain in particular, and Germany and France did. There are elements of those elements are important, but it is about the market power imbalance. And that has been the Australian route. And that is the right route to go, because basically what it says is you, Google and Facebook, have accidentally, and they didn't set out to do this on purpose, certainly when they were starting out. It took them a while to cotton on to the fact that they were getting all this data. This data is incredibly rich. They know everything about the news that we're looking at, and this is where the news journalism does deserve compensation. So they read off you reading news about a whole series of preferences that they then use to sell the aggregated attention of a very thinly sliced, micro slicing the audience's attention is what Google and Facebook do. That imbalance, because they've got thousands of data points on you, all your shopping, all your search history, ways of, they say they don't look at your Google Mail if you're with Google Mail, but they're all various vectors and ways in which they can put together such a compelling degree of segmentation. So that the AAAC, the equivalent of the Competition Commission in Australia to the South African one, has taken the market imbalance approach to say, it really is not something that is going to be fixed one organization to another. So it's forced Google and Facebook to enter into basically cash partnerships. Now, what Google and Facebook have done, the reason why there's been a standoff, essentially derives from their biggest fear, and the thing they want least is for people to look inside the algorithmic black boxes. So these black boxes are where those decisions are made. What you see on your news feed is very different to what I see. What you see on your Facebook feed, even your search results would be kind of customized. So what they don't want is anybody looking in there. And that's what they've pushed back against the most. They've said this thing where we've got to give newspapers 60 days notice if we're going to change our search criteria, that's giving the newspapers or the news industry or the TV stations, radio stations, an unfair competitive advantage. So we're not going to do that. And we'll go for the nuclear option. And Google was making even louder noises than Facebook. But eventually they looked at it, and the pressure has worked because they are now spending hundreds of millions of dollars directly with larger news organizations. The big controversy in Australia this week is how do you get the smaller news organizations to get a fair share? You have to have an income of over 2.5 million rand to even qualify to get these deals with Facebook and Google, 150,000 Australian dollars. So our report looks at the collaboration and the possibilities of working with Google News Initiative. Anya looks at that a lot. It's a really, these guys have got a lot of money and they want to get on with making more of that money, but they've got so much money that one, I think, needs to have a very tactical stance about both conflict and collaboration. It's worked essentially very well in Australia. So just mindful of time, I'm going to wrap up by saying that we need to lance the boil of the SABC's funding. We need to admit that not being able to get more than 3 out of 10 people to pay, there's a lot of reasons for that, which we go into. But so the big kind of shift is away, I believe, is away from licensing fees into bespoke levies collected by competent authorities. You only need 7 or 8 billion, I say only, but in the Eastern Cape alone, we paid 300 million just on lawsuits with the police in 2018. Gauteng is looking at last year, 1 billion payout in medical malpractice suits. So there's money sloshing around, and don't get me started on SAA or all of the other areas, exactly the arguments that the students are making at the moment. So ring fencing it, using charters, the BBC charter is a 10-year charter, the Australian charter is a 3-year charter, so that the Treasury can't get greedy when these funds come in. It's got to be ring fenced, and there's got to be these long-term agreements that says this money is yours. We will never go and dip into these funds, and you have that certainty of funding. And that will allow, I think we need a kind of PSM outwards approach to reviving our local media. And then the final major kind of point in the finding, which I know we'll talk about, is just thinking a lot about the affordability of data. It's kind of beyond journalism, but it's so integrated in people's knowledge systems, information systems, how we find things out. And even though the Competition Commission in South Africa has forcibly brought prices down, they still more than they should be, and we covered that in the report. The SANEF report that came out about the way that Reg Rumney did, and Reg contributed to this report, and really does wonderful research in terms of media economics in South Africa. All of those are pointing to the need to kind of have our broader environment kind of evened out. And whether we zero rate news or not, we look at that debate in some detail. I won't go through it here, but there are some serious net neutrality issues around that, and there may be slightly better ways of doing it than zero rating. But let's have that discussion in the broader session. So I'm gonna leave it at that and just say thank you very much. And I hope you read the report. I'd love the feedback. There are lots of areas that we still want to do more things in more depth around, but certainly I think it's enough to get the conversation to a slightly different level. We're hoping that it will be. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Harry, for this very wide-ranging and detailed report. Now we turn to Bulelwa from the Open Society Foundation for South Africa, who funded this report. Your response, please. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and welcome to everyone. I think we've got about 66 people attending today. So I'm going to try and keep my remarks very short because I think the debate and the conversations that we're going to have is likely to be very rich and very rewarding. I'm hoping to keep my time to exactly 10 minutes if I can. I will talk generally on some really very general points and then talk specifically to the report, and then end my comments with sharing with you about what OSFSA is wanting to do in this year in assisting journalism. So let me start by saying that, I don't think it can be a robust democracy without a very independent and robust media. That everybody knows. And as we've heard from Harry's presentation, clearly that is under threat, not only in South Africa, but all over the world. Also, I mean, I've always had great admiration for journalists who do this out of passion, even in very difficult situations. But we also know that COVID has really decimated the media in South Africa and all over the African continent, to be honest. And when people needed credible information, timely information, the media industry itself was really in a time of crisis. I think the last test I remember around about July last year was that 700 journalists had lost their jobs as a direct result of COVID-19. I'm sure Swu can probably update us on the latest figures in that. It is for this reason that we as OSF have committed to doing what we can do to sustain the sector. We do not have infinite resources, of course, but I'm very happy that we were able to contribute about 1.5 million last year to SANEF, Media Relief Fund. And we are hoping that we will be able to still do quite more this year. And in terms of the report itself, of course, we haven't had a chance to look at it directly, but it's, as you know, it was commissioned by OSFSA, literally before I even joined OSFSA, because I joined them towards the end of 2019. So I want to thank the team that has worked with Harry on this, especially Akita Mohammed, for all her hard work to get it to where it is, to support Harry, to support the production of the report. We realize that the advent of COVID has altered the nature of the report, understandable so. And I mean, as someone who's heading up a country office of a big philanthropy like OSF, I often wonder what philanthropists can do to support journalism. We are very much aware, of course, that whatever support we give does not come without baggage. And therefore, it's always very important that there is transparency and disclosure in terms of where we invest as philanthropists and how we invest and with whom we invest. I think about the high barriers to entry in terms of becoming a journalist, which is why we also support journalistic training through various media and digital grants that we give. We can't have a situation, as Harry has said, I mean, for me, really, up front and center is the States, where those young people who can afford to work for free are accelerated into a media career via unpaid internships. And therefore they lose interest and are unable to sustain themselves. The recommendation from the report around data provision, which suggests that data needs to be seen as part of the social infrastructure, are really quite encouraging, because we really truly believe that data needs to be as affordable as possible and needs to be quality data. And we've seen during COVID how important that has been. And of course, we've seen the disparity between the data haves and have-nots, and how that has played out in terms of the pandemic when education was also online. The report has also solidified my thinking around the decline of media in South Africa. I was concerned to read about the impact on community newspapers and radio stations. Many of these are mother tongue outlets, which are so important for people to receive credible, timely information in their own language, especially since COVID has been, especially since COVID has affected these platforms so strongly. We see this especially in conversations around the vaccine hesitancy, the myths and the misinformation and disinformation about the prevention and treatment of COVID during this time. We worry about the role of specialized journalism if there is what happens if there's inadequate support for journalism in general. We have had time to engage with this report very briefly today because it only came today, but I think that in future, as we become more familiar with the content of the report, we'll look forward to being able to activate some of the recommendations that have come through as we've heard from Harry's presentation. And I would like to come now to my last comment, which is really about our plans for 2021 in terms of supporting journalism in South Africa. We've got a couple of strategic priorities around this area, around this key focus area, which is around the protection and the growth of free, specialized and independent media, sustainability of community media, to create spaces for the advancement of digital democracy, and supporting the protection of human rights defenders. Our goals for the next 4 years, we're taking it in terms of 2-year periods. So 21, 22, we are hoping that we'll have a self-reliant and sustainable sector in terms of journalism, that we can spark innovation in community media, that we can activate specialized journalism and equip the sector with the necessary resources. It would be great if we can train about 100 young Black journalists per annum who can become specialists in various sectors. In addition to our usual grant making, we intend to host virtual convenings on the COVID-19 vaccine and invite our media partners to those sort of conversations in the hope that they can be able to send the right message and the accurate scientific message around vaccine justice, vaccinations in general, and address the issue of vaccine hesitancy, which we see as a big challenge. There are, of course, many challenges around the vaccine justice at the moment. The outcomes we hope to achieve via these convenings are that we were hoping that we will debunk the myths around vaccination rollout and plans and efficacy of vaccine, and demystify factual versus political evidence around vaccines, expose the status of our healthcare system and highlight best practices where necessary, and have rigorous debates around vaccine hesitancy versus vaccine enthusiasm, and activate a call to action via a campaign with a clear messaging. I'm going to end here and hope that I can be able to take questions from the audience when the time comes. But I'm hoping that these few remarks will then activate us to have a robust debate this afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bulelwa, for a very comprehensive response. And I wonder, with all the plans which you have outlined, whether you won't be getting a series of requests for funding from journalists. Thank you so much for that. Now we turn to Sbu, the chairperson of the South African National Editors Forum. Thank you. Over to you, Sbu.
Thank you very much, Francis. Good afternoon, colleagues. Good afternoon to my fellow panelists, Prof. Dagmo and Sis Bulelwa Ngewana. This research, actually, it comes at a time when our industry is in turmoil. And I don't think as SANEF, we could have hoped for a better time for it to land, because it comes at a time when we as SANEF are starting these conversations around the sustainability of the media in South Africa. And I will get to that in detail. And I think the one important thing here is that given our mandate as SANEF and our commitment to championing media freedom and defending our hard-won freedom of expression as guaranteed in the Constitution, we do believe that fundamentally that the issue of transparency and accountability, those are principles that are at the center of our Constitution. And tied to that is our call for universal access to public service journalism. And I think it's in line with that. Some of you will recall, and I think Harry also mentioned this as well, that SANEF had done research. Now, the statistics that Sisbulelo was sharing about 700 journalists having lost their jobs. Now, that was just research, dipstick research that we did between March and June of 2020, which is not the whole picture, because we are still now in the process of updating that research to look at the further impact for the rest of the year and including into this year. Now, if you look at that research, which showed us that you already had over 700 journalists losing their jobs within a space of 3 months, and no less than 50, in fact, no less than 80 local and hyperlocal publications had to close down during that period. Now, SANEF, all of this happens at a time when SANEF was in the process of doing the media ethics and credibility research that was done by, that was headed by Judge Kathleen Satchwell. And one of the findings and one of the recommendations actually was around SANEF starting a conversation that looks around a media sustainability fund. How do we sustain the media beyond COVID-19, given the debilitating effect that it has had on the industry? And one of the things that were noted in the report was actually how how the poor people that are on the fringes of our country, on our democracy, are actually disenfranchised, and they continue to be left out in terms of the media focus and also access to the media. And it made the following point that, and I quote, "Transformation of the South African media has been haphazard and incomplete, and the nation's majority population remains severely underrepresented in media ownership and control, and the voices and languages heard on media platforms, and also in the capacity to access those platforms as news consumers." And that's the independent report headed by Judge Satchwell. That was the observation. And they went on to also talk about how ownership has actually become concentrated. Now, having done some research with the assistance of OSF, I must say OSF is a friend, we consider OSF as a friend of SANEF. Having done that research, which we are now updating, we are actually at a point now where we are looking at a research that looks at two particular topics: a media sustainability fund, but also the topic that Harry touches on of zero rating of public service journalism platforms. And I see that in his recommendations, he says that it's not a magic bullet. And I think we do understand that, but I think it's an important conversation, particularly as we talk about access to the media, because if we talk about media sustainability and universal access to public interest journalism, it goes into the heart of the cost of data and the ability of the poor to access journalism. Because as it stands, I mean, even in the research that we did, we were able to identify the fact that while COVID had decimated the industry, the reality is that the interest in credible news, in news related to COVID-19, saw an increase, a sharp increase in the traffic, online traffic of various news sites, some by as much as 100%. Now that tells you that there is general interest, and there is interest in such information, particularly insofar as it helps the society. So that also shows you that had we had broader access, more universal access to journalism that would actually allow for more people to access that information and not be excluded by the mere fact that they cannot afford data. So one of, as I said, I want to talk more about what some of the discussions we've been having at SANEF, particularly around the Media Sustainability Fund. And it's actually no different. Some of those conversations are no different from some of the examples from the various jurisdictions that Harry has looked at in terms of what can we do. And some of the big question that keeps coming up, Harry, is whether we should involve government or not, as more people are concerned about political pressure over that. And I think that I like the point that you make, that it's actually not an anomaly for public funding of journalism. And I think in this country, actually, it wouldn't be either, because if when I talk about the issue of universal access and the issue of transparency and the free flow of information, those are actually principles that are in our constitution. So supporting journalism through public funding, but also private funding, looking at some of those examples that we have seen from other jurisdictions. Now, when we talk about the issue of zero rating, it becomes an interesting topic, because when we already, for instance, you know that in South Africa that access to education websites, they have been zero rated. And also at the time, when the state of national disaster was declared, there was I think there was an update, an amendment, or in fact, a gazetting of regulations around opening up access and zero rating platforms to some sites or sites with health information, and those would be designated by the health department. So it's not to say that in South Africa the conversation has not started, but then the big question becomes, who do you let in? Who benefits from that? Given the fact that there are established companies and also smaller publications, who benefits from the zero rating? And I think that's an ongoing conversation that we have to have among ourselves as to if we do zero rate, who can be advanced or said to be a journalism outlet in distress. But I think those are part of the ongoing conversations that we're having in the country. But I think that it's actually an important tool as we look into the different tools that we can use to ensure the sustainability of our industry in the country. And I think the important point that Bulelo also touched on is also around the disinformation. And as we're facing these headwinds as an industry, we're also living at a time when, as an industry, as journalists and as the media in South Africa, there is a lot of political pressure. There's intensifying hostility towards the media. I mean, you would have seen in the news in recent times, in recent days, where journalists from ENCA have been hounded at marches. And that has direct to do actually with the calls by the EFF and sponsored by their leadership to say that their supporters must actually block or not speak to ENCA. But what that leads to is the harassment of journalists. And I think that also becomes another issue that we have to deal with, because the question then becomes, how do you go beyond, for instance, particularly for us as SANEF, beyond just condemning the acts and calling for the political leadership to be responsible. And also it may be ENCA today, but tomorrow it will be Newsroom Africa, and the other day it may be the SABC or any other organization. So that kind of behavior, intolerance behavior and abuse actually is what we need to nip in the bud, and perhaps some of the conversations we are having as we go forward, because issues of the credibility of the media are also in sharp focus, but at the same time, there's also the issue of the safety of journalists. And I know that some people, Harry and Bulelo and colleagues, have said, why don't you as the media or just boycott such parties? And I think that's not helpful. We don't believe that that is helpful. To boycott the third largest party in a democracy would actually be counterproductive, because we as the media do not cover a party, for instance, like the EFF, so that we can, as though we're doing them a favor. It is actually part of our role in the strengthening of democracy, because it is important that they are a party represented in parliament, but that we know what they are saying, what they are thinking, what they are planning, and what as a party their policies are, and generally to be able to impart that information to the general population. So we get stuck in that point, and we keep, as an organization, for instance, we keep condemning such action. Perhaps some have been saying, what do we do beyond that? And I think that's probably one of the questions we may have to answer, because what that attack on the media does, it also further erodes our credibility, because there are deliberate attempts to paint the media as either anti-transformation or being under the control of big business, and being against society. So I think media sustainability and strong independent media is what underpins our democracy. And the point that Sisbulelwa makes, as I wrap up, is an important one, to say we've got shrinking newsrooms. We've got companies closing down. What do we do to make sure that these voices that have taken over our social media spaces and are spreading untruths about vaccines, about journalists, about journalism, discrediting journalists, how do we make sure that we counter that and counter them strongly, and ensure that we continue in our important role of supporting our fledgling democracy? So I think, colleagues, without wasting any more time, those are the topics I wanted to touch on, but also just to respond specifically to some of the issues that Harry raises in this research. And as I said, that it actually dovetails with the very research that, and also conversations that we have started here in South Africa around, in fact, as SANEF, and engaging with other partners to say, how do you make sure, for instance, a company that does not subscribe to the press council, like independent newspapers, how do you bring them into the fold when the PIC is refusing to get involved as a shareholder? And then perhaps someone says that perhaps we should make sure that whatever media sustainability fund we end up with, should one of the prerequisites, because we need to have safeguards, one of the prerequisites must be that all companies or all media organizations that can prove that they are actually credible sites that produce public service journalism. In fact, I do regard journalism, all journalism, as a public good. So I guess that also broadens the debate. But also, how do you make sure that they are all accountable, that everyone, then you then say everyone who benefits from such initiatives must at least be a member or subscribe to the Press Council of South Africa. And I'm glad that Latifa is here from the Press Council. So I think, as I said broadly, colleagues, so that I can allow for the questions from the participants, those are some of the issues we're looking at. But thank you very much, Harry, for this research. As I said, it does help us a great deal as the South African National Editors Forum. Thank you, Francis, and back to you.
Thanks so much, Boo. I mean, you have a thankless and tough job there ahead of you. We wish you all the best. At this time, we are taking questions. Harry, I can see there are 2 questions for you in the chat function there, which have been posted for you. Do you want to start responding, Harry? Thank you.
Sure, and I think I'll throw it open to all of us on the panel, but also to other members of the audience. Just looking at the question in terms of editorial independence. So absolutely, every country that's had to deal with the idea of state funding, you have to find a mechanism through which people are very often reluctant to the old cliche, bite the hand that feeds them. And if the hand that is feeding you is the government, it's different from a commercial hand or the audience money that you get from revenue. So you need protection from that pressure. But equally so, we've seen in so many developing countries, we have seen a lot of pressure put through advertising. So one of the calls for local media for a long time has been, let government spend 30% of its entire marketing budget supporting small local community media. That should be done without political favor. But how do you do that? You need a mechanism. And so one of the calls we make in the report is for MDDA-like body to be set up. It may be the same kind of thing that SANEF is thinking about. So an MDDA, but that's not for media development more generally, but specifically to support journalism. So you want the MDDA to be strong. You want people to be able to apply for funds and do the things that they've done, building community radio stations and broadcast and training and a lot of the wonderful work they've done. But we have to recognize that firstly, they've always been radically underfunded, literally 1/10 of what people agreed was necessary right from the start, and it's never really got better. But you need a mechanism that's even less prone to political interference to make those decisions. And that would be SANEF, civil society, civil organizations, trade union representatives. I like getting the idea of getting trusted figures in the interfaith communities in these bodies, and just making it a moral and ethical decision rather than this political pressure that we've seen coming elsewhere. So that would be the answer to not an answer, but just to put it out there. But let me put it out there is, you know, what kind of arm's length mechanisms would happen, because the SABC board is also supposed to be independent and yet it's subject to those pressure. And one thing I have noticed from the research that we've done is that all the public service media around the world, as the authoritarian populists get more power, as the news cause, they never stop shouting at and trying to tear down public service media, because they want to create that information vacuum so that their particular brand of politics, the Boris Johnsons, the Donald Trumps, the Bolsonaros, the Dutertes, that authoritarian populism, that rise of the right around the world, the first thing they've got to do is they've got to smash the independent journalism that can call them to account, that can show their lies. And we've got to be so careful of that in South Africa, that we saw a media empire built from scratch with its own 24-hour TV station, with provincial newspaper, the New Nation, that appeared in 9 provinces, trying to get government money, but essentially just as a cover for looting, just to take our eyes away from what was really going on. And that's why it's so important to try and find an independent mechanism.
Thank you so much, Harry. What's your take on that, Bulelwa?
Sorry, I don't have a solution. I just know that it needs to happen. Because, I mean, there is no such thing as money without baggage. But what is important is that that baggage needs to be on the table, and that people need to understand what the implication of what that baggage is, and the impact of that baggage on the resources it's trying to support. So we are a philanthropy, and of course we have our own baggage, but we've been a philanthropy in South Africa that has been very bold in taking very brave steps, even though we know we also get backlash from that, you know. But we do that because we truly believe that it's important. For us, it's important to hold government to account, but it's also important to help government when they need that support. Because to always hold them to account, name, shame, and blame doesn't get to a solution. We need to be able to co-create solutions together when necessary with different divergent views. I'm always amazed that our democracy emerged from a very unique dialogue on the basis of very, very, very different perspectives, backgrounds, and politics. And yet we seem to have lost that in 2021. As we are about to turn 30 as a democracy, we no longer use dialogue as a way of co-creating solutions. Maybe that's what's needed. This is why I'm really enthusiastic about this kind of platforms where we can talk and see how we can co-create these solutions. We don't have a one big bang silver bullet in terms of solving this. We need very different ways of doing it, and then we can pilot and experiment and take lessons from other parts of the world. But my fear is that we are not moving fast enough, and Rome is burning, and we are busy, you know, playing at the edges. We need to do bold and very audacious things to make things change. I heard this morning in another platform that the South African Africa's recovery from COVID is in fact aimed, it probably, if we get the vaccines at the right time, it will take anything between 6 to 7 years. And now you ask yourself, what is the future of journalism in that space when the economy is so embattled? So sorry, Francis, I can't give you answers. I can just raise more questions because these are the questions that we need to grapple with. Thanks.
Thank you. Look,
Sbu, I mean, this directly affects your members. What do you think? What kind of a body would have this arm's length, let's say, relationship with whatever quasi-governmental body which should control this funding? Because really, wherever there's political pressure, it does seem that governments and the other organizations want to indeed influence your editorial policies and content. Thank you.
Thanks, Francis. I mean, with or without government funding, actually, as things stand, there will always be attempts to influence the media. And obviously, I do understand the apprehension of some of the participants around the idea of government funding. And I think in looking for solutions, there are various options on the table. I mean, I think also Harry's report touches on that, where it can be direct funding. And I think, I know in countries like Australia, through their media relief fund, they go the length of either buying paid subscription in digital platforms. I know in other jurisdictions, in terms of the tax incentives that have been spoken of, they talk about zero rating, in fact, not zero rating, but giving a tax incentive for those who buy paid subscription. So there are various options, and it's also not to say that the government involvement, I think you cannot avoid involving government in conversations around the sustainability of the media. I mean, we are a democracy and we do have a democratic government at the end of the day. And I think more importantly, actually, there are also other aspects that relate to that actually have a direct impact on the issue of sustainability, issues of licensing. You cannot have that without bringing in an ICASA. I mean, there are also transmission fees that broadcasters pay, so it goes into the heart of those conversations. But I think in talking about a platform or how do you ring fence that fund? How do you make sure that it is free of government interference or political interference? I mean, the easiest thing is to think about what we did when we launched the SANEF, the Media Relief Fund, which was just about the immediate relief for journalists, where we paid out amounts of about 5,000 rands each to a number of journalists. That one of the things we did was to say that to avoid the questions or to avoid being tainted, we will accept donations from everyone else except for political parties. But in this instance, you don't have to say that, but you can say the same, or even go as far as saying that whatever board that we form that runs or manages the Media Relief Fund, or the Media Sustainability Fund rather, that board must be free of government or political parties, so as to make sure that perhaps you are able to at least make sure that it's a credible body that is seen to be free of outside influence. And I think Sisbulela made the point earlier that you can never actually run away from that. And there'll always be attempts to influence the media one way or the other. But I think those that becomes a starting point in probably answering that question. Thanks, Francis.
Thanks a lot, Sbu. There are quite a few questions there which are being directed to the speakers, and anyone cares to answer some of them? I see there is Martina here saying a media fund that draws on taxation will be subject to parliament oversight and quite likely a similar board appointment process to the SABC and the MDDA. Legislation governing such a fund would have to be carefully drafted with stakeholder input. Harry, are you aware of any such legislative effort? Thank you.
Not not off the top of my head in the sense of South African initiatives, but just thinking about some of the other jurisdictions that we've looked at. If one thinks about the Judicial Services Commission in South Africa, possibly a little bit more than the MDDA or the SABC board process, you may want to open up that, precisely if there's going to be government money, they're going to say we need a board, we need that kind of parliamentary oversight. And when things are going better, as they are now, that works a bit differently to what it may have done in for example, the Zuma era, where there was a lot of loading of those kind of things. So how one extracts that funding into charter organizations is very, firstly, you've got to get the money, you've got to get government to agree, where's this money going to come from? And where's it going to be put, and where's it going to sit? So I'm not aware of those kind of legislative efforts. If you're thinking maybe, Martina, of other countries, I must just think about that a little bit. But I did notice also Francis' question, and I just wanted to shift the thinking a little bit to what we try and do in the report, is to say that the real crisis is actually at the local areas. That, yeah, there's a big problem with the circulations of the Daily Dispatch and the EP Herald and the Sunday Times and with terrestrial broadcast news, the SABC bulletins, etc. But the radio stations are still doing pretty well, and the SABC's radio stations still have incredibly viable audiences, and they need to be built, and their digital capacity needs to be built. But the crisis in most countries is at that smaller level, is at the most vulnerable parts of the ecosystem. So somehow, whatever funds we put together for digital transition, journalism sustainability, innovation funds, etc., the big criticisms in Canada, in the UK, in Australia, which are wealthy nations, is you've helped the big guys too much and the small guys not enough. And even this Australia thing now with the Google and Facebook code, excluding anybody that its turnover is less than $150,000, which is 2 million rand a year. So a lot of small newspapers just not going to get any money from Google and Facebook. And some of the biggest, Sydney Morning Herald are going to get millions and millions. Now, I'm pleased that all parts of the ecosystem above a certain level are going to get money. But actually, we could lead the way in trying to develop mechanisms of working with local audiences. Just imagine working with in the Eastern Cape, working in Makana, working in any of these areas with local communities, local activists, just putting together committees and then getting money into the hands of some kind of regional body. I think we need to save local, we need to go local, and maybe you need 9 little mini MDDAs, which I know MDDA does have some kind of provincial structure, but maybe you can work on that local side to get credible local representatives, again from a broad range of society, to sit on those bodies and be closer to the ground in that way.
Yeah, if I can just come in, Francis, I support what Harry is saying quite strongly. I mean, there's also something, another stakeholder that we are forgetting here, which is the average South African, who actually is the consumer of the product. And I always find that advert from SABC, pay your TV license, is the right thing to do, quite depressing, because it never explains why is it the right thing to do. Even here we've got 60 odd people. I wonder how many people here who are in South Africans that pay that TV license, because there's a resentment from the population of paying that TV license, because they think that the money is going to be used in many, in many unsavory ways, as well as the fact that there has been credibility loss on SABC in itself. So there is a lot that needs to happen around educating the population to be able to do the right thing. Because a lot of those local communities depend solely on that radio station that speaks the language to be able to get the right news. And when we were talking about, I saw a question around the training of journalism, is to be able to foster paid internships through established journalist houses to be able to take a number of interns to train in the 12 different languages that we know that are official in South Africa. And that is something that we can, as OSF, put our resources to and be able to make it part of a grant requirement for the various grantees that we have. And we have a lot of grantees. It's not just SANEF. I mean, with our freedom and expression portfolio is quite broad. But we do need to be also, as I say, work at the bigger picture and be very bold and brave in pushing for really big and audacious goals in order for us to get to where we need to get to very quickly. Thanks.
Thank you. Let me turn this a little bit asking Sbu. One of the critical things critics seem to be pointing out is the failure of media organizations and journalists themselves to sort out or to find new workable business models in a rapidly changing world. And then there is the issue of the loss of trust by the public and indeed the credibility. So in other words, the media and journalism are facing those three crises which impact not just their sustainability, but they have a broader impact in terms of really where we go from here. What would you say, Sbu?
I think as a starting point, Francis, it goes without saying that media owners and organizations in South Africa did not adapt as quickly as they should. I mean, I think for the longest time, we all watched as trends were changing globally. And we could say, I think there was a time when we could safely say that whatever is happening in the States or some parts of Europe, it'll probably take some good 4 or 5 years before that train hits our station. But then what I think COVID has actually, I mean, even by the time COVID-19 broke out, the reality was that we're already seeing a rapid decline in newspaper, particularly in print publication subscriptions. As someone who has edited a regional newspaper in the Eastern Cape, the Daily Dispatch, we kind of knew what we could track over the years was that the decline was always around 10, 12% year on year. And that was normally what it was tracking. But what COVID-19 then did was to exacerbate that problem, which caught, well, we were aware, but I mean, it kind of like decimated the industry. So I think in terms of finding new models, that the reality is that, as I said, it's already happened. We were hit by that train, but then how do we make sure that going forward, we are sustainable? I mean, for me, I think going back to the question that Harry was answering earlier, and I think it was posed also around the importance of local media. The recent stats I was talking about, for instance, of the subscription decline of the Daily Dispatch, even if you look at the Dispatch and the Herald, actually, over the COVID-19 period, where you've had newspapers that have lost circulation about 80%, I think in the case of Pretoria News, others averaging about 40. But you can see that with these regional publications, you can see that their decline is anywhere between, tracking anywhere between 10 and 20%. They have been hit, but not to that greater extent. I think that also underlines the importance of ring fencing and actually protecting local media, not just and not just your big companies where ownership seems to be concentrated. And secondly, part of the reason why when the SABC was announcing its retrenchments, part of the reason why we said, please be transparent and please make sure as a national broadcaster that you do not touch the regions, you protect the regions. It is actually understanding the importance of those localities and those communities having access to the media, because we had already seen from our side that those 80 publications that closed, they did not belong to the big 3 or big 4 media, print media companies. Those were small publications in those localities. And if you look also at the trends, I think Harry makes the point about how do you make sure that those guys are not left out? And I think we can learn actually from the lessons from other jurisdictions to say, whatever support that we get, it must not be exclusionary to the fact, I mean, considering the fact that most of the small publications that we already have cannot make even that 150,000 US dollars, the benchmark that Harry was talking about. But I think we'll have to find our own solutions, drawing from all these lessons. I hope I've answered your question there. Thank you, Francis.
Thank you so much. Who wants to join in there, jump into the discussion? Harry?
Just seeing Latifa's point about local media piggybacking in terms of financial training, how one get, there will always be, I think, a declining portion of commercial revenue, but there will always be a portion. Because if you've got a great publication or a good little radio station or a digital podcast or just a good piece of media that's giving people verified information, you develop a following because they know that you are applying good journalism training, you're doing the verification, you're going to have that audience to sell. And so there will always be a piece of that. And it's a very hard set of skills. So a lot of the smaller publications we've seen right across that selling, that keep getting the money in, running the finances. It's fine when the rivers of gold were flowing 20 years ago and people were knocking on your door to advertise in the Dispatch and the Herald or Growcots or all the hundreds of, I mean, the Eastern Cape used to have 20, 30, each week coming out papers. That's gone to very little, but that's part of the transition from print. Those could still be online, and some of them are, and still getting some digital advertising. The question is, can one add to that the capacity to also collect some audience revenue? And then the subsidies that one can either get from philanthropy, from local crowdfunding, from membership fees, which very, very hard if you, even in a sizable city, a small city or small town, to have things like membership models. It might work for the Maverick, or it might work for some of the more famous publications in the rest of the world. But that sharing of skills and that piggybacking, I think, is something we must kind of look at, the mentoring of that. That's this notion of the ecosystem, is this idea of competing. We're all going to have to start cooperating a lot more. Those big companies competing, that capitalist model, going for the scoops. We saw in the Satchwell report, the ethic report, is that part of that pressure to be fast rather than to be accurate comes from that competitive pressure. And we actually need to take a more public service view of media and set up cooperatives, more news cooperatives. The one thing we do say in the final chapter of the report is much more around solutions from below. How do we encourage communities to say from their own voices, what would you like to see and how can we do it? The community radio station sector is actually one of the greatest examples in South Africa of people doing it for themselves. What we should do with those community radio stations, help them have more journalism. So many of them have very little journalism. They broadcast in 18 hours a day, 20 hours a day. There's a lot of services, and there's a lot of there's a fair amount of preaching. There's a lot of music. Some of them are very music orientated. It wouldn't be that difficult to try and help them have a 3-minute news bulletin on the hour every hour, with some resources from the SABC, with some resources from Arena, or with just give people more. Yeah, the bottom up needs to meet the top down.
Yes, thanks so much. There are lots of questions here. Obviously, we cannot go through all of them, but I think this is significant. Someone is asking, this is John, are you not missing that the media business model collapsed because the revenue moved from media houses to Facebook and Google? This is a critical point which you referred to earlier, I think, Harry, in your presentation. Especially looking at the Australian example, what Facebook and Google were doing there. Indeed, people would want to know, shouldn't these, Facebook and Google pay for the news, which they are using from the originators of the news? So far, they've been having a free reign, effectively, despite all cosmetic arrangements of this and that. Let me ask Sbu on that. What do you think, Sbu? And then come back to Harry. Thanks.
Thanks, Francis. I mean, I think in fact, there are a number of things that I can say on that point. But I just want to start. There was a question that I need to address that was in the group. If you don't mind, it was around zero rating and equal rating of health sites and education sites. Agida, already there are, for instance, news or education sites are already zero rated, and at the last year already, when the state of disaster was declared, there was the gazetting, there was rules, introduction of rules by the government to say, to a list of websites, particularly health-related sites with key information around COVID-19 issues of treatment and access to information generally, where they were directed, they were already zero rated. So in talking about this, those are some of the lessons we are drawing from already. Now, going back with John, I mean, the reality is that we do know that most of the advertising has gone there. And I think Harry, in his report, and also in other jurisdictions, in fact, in Australia and other countries already, that's what they're talking about how they can claw back some of that advertising spend that has gone to the big companies like a Facebook and Alphabet, which is the owners of Google. But I think I like the idea also of partnerships within media companies. I think that also is an important one. Instead of looking for external solutions, that we also talk among ourselves, because the very question you're asking me earlier about credibility of journalism, that also is a factor, because that very report by the Sexual Commission, that report was exactly necessitated by some of the ethical flaws that we saw in some of our biggest newsrooms like the Sunday Times, but not limited to the Sunday Times, but various other organizations where everyone wants to be the first to the story, and those mistakes happen, and we still see them until today. That then is one thing we need to work on, and that is why actually flowing from that report, we will be having a media ethics and a credibility conference at the end of April, which will actually bring in all the players. We will look into some of this research, have research like Harry's, look at some of the own research that we've done, bring in various speakers on some of those topics as we forge a way forward. Because for us, it's not a matter of saying that, yes, the media has played a role and contributed to its own destruction, so therefore we must stand back. Yes, if it can be fixed, yes, we may not get, the trust is built over time. We do understand that, and there's an existing trust deficit. But what is important is that there must be deliberate attempts on the side of the media to kind of fix that which is wrong. And I think, lastly, Kate, I see in the group, has actually reminded me that the SANEF, actually, part of this conversation that we've started with various stakeholders, both in the media and also in government, is that we have also initiated a discussion with the presidency to say that perhaps at that level, let's look at a presidential working group, which will include private, they will include sections of government and some institutions of government like your ICASAs, the Department of Communications, but also media owners, people involved in advertising, in marketing, to kind of look at and also researchers and journalists as well, to be part of this broader group that looks at issues of media sustainability. We believe that that is a starting point in that regard. In fact, the president had tasked the late Minister Jackson Mthembu to spearhead, in fact, to lead that project from the side of government. And we had had a few meetings with him by the time of his untimely passing. And one of the things that we had raised with the president was to say that perhaps we would want to see a continuation of some of those discussions going forward. But yes, the issue of media credibility is an important one for us, and something that which I believe is an ongoing project which we cannot remedy overnight. Thanks, Francis.
So much, Boo. I have less than 5 minutes. So Harry, just 1 minute for you to wrap up.
Sure.
And, thank you.
So I'm just going to address very briefly. I agree with the comments that have been made in the report. We need to think about taking a similar approach in South Africa to the Australian approach, which is to get a competition commission to be the bad guy. And that they did it with MTM and Vodacom, and they forced them to produce something that ICASA couldn't do in 15 years, which is a reduction in data price. So you take a case to them, make the same case that the industry made here. It's an independent it is a quasi-judicial body with proper judges, etc. And they make a ruling, you will come to the party. And in Australia, they made it was initially a voluntary code, and they made it a mandatory code. And then you have the fight. And especially if you can just brave it out. When Google does withdraw Google Maps from South Africa, they won't do it for more than a week. I don't know, maybe South Africa would have to resist in different ways. When Facebook took news off, there was such an outcry from around the world and in Australia. It lasted for 5 days. They've capitulated. They're paying hundreds of millions of dollars now just to be left alone. But John's point is right. There's a precedent now. That's what Google and Facebook wanted to avoid. And I think we need to do a combination of two things. Go to Google and Facebook and say, don't make us do what the Australians did. So be nice to us, give us lots of cash, and we can maybe have a slightly more, I don't like to use the word collaborative, but they do have some initiatives, the Google News Initiative and things like that. Or we go the hard route that the Australians went.
Your closing remarks about the issue of trying to get funding or to ask Google and Facebook and other technological platforms to pay for the news they've been using. What is your take? And just close, to sum up your, your thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, so I will have to think a little bit more about that and read the report to see what the case study says. But in terms of just closing remarks, I will say we just need to keep front and center that without a robust, independent, trusted media, we really don't have a robust and sustainable democracy. So this is not just a peripheral issue, it's a front and center issue if we want this democracy to survive. It is important to be able to trust the news that you read, to be informed about the politics of the nation, and be able to make a decision when you actually put that vote on that paper, that X on that paper at the voting station. It is for us, it is as simple as that. Yes, there's many complexities to the issue, and I'm sure it can be tackled in many various ways. Very encouraged by what SANEF is doing, and very impressed, in fact, with a lot of the comments that have been made in this platform. So let's continue to dialogue and finding and co-creating solutions. Thanks.
Thank you all for attending this very exciting and insightful, webinar. So many questions to be asked. I know, Harry, I'm sorry, I had to cut you there because we've run out of time. Thank you to our speakers, Harry from Brisbane. Thank you so much, Bulelwa from OSF. Thank you so much, Sbu from SANEF. This, I hope, is our last webinar before we attend or we host the Highway Africa Summit, which will be from June 21 to 23. We hope to see some of you there. Very provocative, interesting topics, and top-notch speakers. With that, I should close this. Thank you so much, and all have a good day.